inclusion is a space where I can walk in and be myself and not have to change who I am to fit in. And there's a beautiful Brene Brown quote that sums it up for me. And it goes something like, if I have to be like you, I fit in. And if I get to be me, I belong. And for me, it's about creating that sense of belonging within a brand community. So brands are like little magnets that draw people. And, people that share the same values or interests will be drawn to a brand that's really pushing those ideas or those values out into the world. And if you come to a brand and you feel like you've got to change yourself to purchase that brand or to use it in some way, then you don't belong. But if you come to the brand and you feel seen and you feel heard, then that brand is absolutely being inclusive.
We are represented. We are represented. We are represented.
Welcome to Represented, the podcast. I'm Aniki Shuru, racial equity coach for online business owners who want to be intentionally inclusive by building a business that is racially equitable. I created this podcast to normalize a conversation around racial inclusion so that fear is no longer the barrier that gets in the way of doing this work. This isn't about perfection, it's about progress. Whether you're taking your first steps or you're well-versed in the journey towards racial equity, this space is for you. So welcome home, friend. Let's get started.
From coast to coast, around the globe, we are represented.
Where are you from? Really? No, originally, where are you from? Can I touch your hair? Your English sounds so good. Nah, I don't see color. Those statements I've shared are just some of the daily microaggressions that people of color face on a regular basis when they occupy white spaces. Microaggressions are subtle yet negative racial messages that leave the person on the receiving end feeling hurt, humiliated, and even disrespected. You may have used these kinds of statements to start a conversation or even break ice with a person of color, but didn't realize the harm you were causing. That's why I've created a free microaggressions guide with 5 of the commonly made microaggressions in online coaching spaces that you need to know about and what you can do or say instead. Head over to anikishuru.com/micro to download your free guide. That's anikishuru, GICHURU.com/micro, MICRO. And welcome to another episode of Represented Podcast. I'm so excited to be back after taking a little short break. And today is a special one because I've got a special guest with me. Her name is Tess Palmyre, and she is the founder of Brandable, an independent agency that champions inclusion in brand strategy, communications, and design. Tess, welcome.
Hi, Annie. It's so great to be here. I've been looking forward to this for weeks. Thank you for the invitation.
Yes, we had a conversation a little while ago, and your work is something that I definitely want to get into the ears of my listeners because it's very much something that they are very interested in, primarily online business owners who are coaches, creatives, consultants, where this work of inclusion is something that is very much they're trying to integrate, but trying to understand how can I do this in a more inclusive way? What am I leaving out without even knowing that I'm leaving out and being very exclusive? How can I still bring who I am as, a white woman, but still be championing and centering inclusion? And so I'd love to know where this idea of Brandable originated from, but more importantly, I'd love to know what inclusion means to Tess.
Yeah, so the idea of Brandable, it's been brewing, or it had been brewing for years before I started it. And I guess in a way, I was already doing it without realizing. So my first career was as a high school teacher. So it was all about connection and communication with students, with their parents, and with other people at the school. Um, my second career, once I went into marketing, yes, it was, I got right into strategy. I really loved consumer behavior and the psychology side of it and really trying to understand people. But because I'm a woman of color, I naturally was trying to embed inclusion best practices without really realizing what I was doing at first. It was just purely from a lived experience. I would start to highlight things that I had lived through that we needed to incorporate in the work that we were doing for a brand. So in some ways, it was quite subconscious at the start. And once I became aware of what I was doing, I really tried to learn as much as I could about the DEI space. But my real issue with the space was it seemed to be pigeonholed in HR or people and culture. And my view was it needed to be embedded from the very heart of the brand and starting with the leaders and then flowing out from there. So, from a brand strategy point of view, you always put the brand at the center, but behind a brand, it's people. So we really have to understand people to build a great brand and to build an inclusive one at that. So for me, getting to the second part of your question, what is inclusion to me? Inclusion is a space where I can walk in and be myself and not have to change who I am to fit in. And there's a beautiful Brene Brown quote that sums it up for me. And it goes something like, if I have to be like you, I fit in. And if I get to be me, I belong. And for me, it's about creating that sense of belonging within a brand community. So brands are like little magnets that draw people. And, people that share the same values or interests will be drawn to a brand that's really pushing those ideas or those values out into the world. And if you come to a brand and you feel like you've got to change yourself to purchase that brand or to use it in some way, then you don't belong. But if you come to the brand and you feel seen and you feel heard, then that brand is absolutely being inclusive. So that's my take. But I guess I'm a brand strategist at heart, so I'm always putting the brand at the center and not really wanting to lose what makes that brand kind of magical. I think if we forget about the brand being quite distinct and magical, we lose a little bit of that the spark. I'm really drawn to Apple, for example. Like for me, that's part of who I am. I'm an Apple user. I'm certainly not PC. Um, and that's part of who I am. But if I didn't feel like seen by Apple, or if I felt like I had to change myself, then I wouldn't feel like Apple is all that inclusive for me.
Mm, I feel like you're answering my second question, which is when you think of a brand, what's the first thing that comes to mind as a marketer as it pertains to inclusion? So let's talk Apple because you're Apple through and through. What is it about it that makes you feel included?
You remember those old it was the old, not iPhone ads, iPod. You remember the original iPod
Yeah,
ads?
yeah.
Okay, so it was the silhouette with the really bright colors in the background, and it was so beautifully done. And the choice of music and the silhouette was done so well that I could see myself and hear myself in the ad without being so concrete and obvious. So they didn't go, oh, we're just going to add a woman of color in this ad, or we're going to put someone in some cultural dress or something. It was so subtly and artistically done that I felt like I was being celebrated without someone trying to check a box. And I think that's when a brand does it really well, you feel like you're sharing an experience with other people beyond your identities. When they do it badly and they're checking boxes, you still feel othered. You still feel like, I feel like you're seeing the world through the usual centered lens, whether it's white or able-bodied or male or whatever it might be, or straight, cis, etc., etc. But somehow you're checking me off as a box and you're trying to include me, but you haven't really done it in a way that I just feel genuinely part of your audience. It still feels a little bit forced. So yeah, for me, it's when they do it so naturally and artistically and subtly that you just feel like you're just part of the audience and they're not shining a spotlight on the thing that makes you different.
What do you think differentiates those who do it that way, where you feel yourself included, you see yourself listening to that kind of music, it's subtle, it's not in your face, it's not black and white, so to speak, but there is an element of inclusion. They've done their work. What differentiates such brands? Is it coming from a place where they've consulted with their ideal market, their ideal clients as to what they like and are able to project that? And those who are not, where you just feel still othered and you're like, hey, I can see this a mile off. You're just being performative. This is not real. And the reason why I ask this question is from a racial equity perspective. I get asked all the time, Annie, how can I be a genuine ally without not coming across as being performative? And I'd love to hear what your answer is from that branding perspective, how Apple are getting it right, and others, you're just still feeling like, yeah, this doesn't feel genuine.
Absolutely. So Brandable's mission statement is building inclusive brands from the inside out. And with that comes this belief that or knowledge that you have to know your audience and your brand very, very deeply. You've got to spend time listening to them and really understanding what different groups of people are about and what really motivates them. And when you sense that it's very much a surface level, tokenistic effort, people will absolutely call it out. So one of the examples that's the opposite of inclusive, I'm not sure if you saw this ad, this was last year, it was Bud Light did a promotion and they used Dylan Mulvaney, who's a trans influencer, very popular, and they rebranded, redid their labels, and it was all very beautiful. And Dylan Mulvaney, they went on Instagram and promoted Bud Light, and it was their anniversary, I believe, of being a trans woman. Anyway, that they had a huge backlash because they didn't, one, it was done very quickly. There was no kind of gentle movement to build inclusion into their brand over time. There was a lack of a disconnect with their real core audience. And it was quite amazing the backlash that happened online to the point of some people like shooting crates of Bud Light beer and saying, I'm never going to drink Bud Light beer ever again. But yeah, so getting back to your question, I think it's about brands that really take the time to listen to their audience and build it into their brand. So it needs to be from the brand purpose right through to their team culture, and then externally their audience needs to be seeing and experiencing inclusion as well.
One of the major things that I encounter with a lot of personal brands is that when they create whatever offer they've created, whatever service they don't have a particular person in mind, or rather, they're creating for, and there's nothing wrong to have a distinct kind of market that you're marketing to and serving. But when that is excluding human beings who cannot change who they are and how they were created, then that becomes a problem. And when you look at systems of, oppression, systems of exclusion, such as white supremacy and capitalism and the patriarchy, when you look at the core of it and you think about who did they have in mind when they created this, it is so clear that certain people were not part of the thought of these are the people that we can serve. And so, what are brands that are not inclusive? What do they look like? What is the general feeling that, as somebody who is a brand strategist and you're working through and you're like, oh, we've got work to do here because there is nothing here that says you serve this kind of group of people?
Yeah, as you were talking, it reminded me of this documentary on Netflix. It was about Abercrombie and Fitch.
Yes.
I'm trying to remember the title of it. Might have been something like White Hot or something. It's such a great documentary to watch, and it's exactly depicting what you've just described. And their brand became all about young, white, attractive people. And they, to the point where they were employing only young, white, attractive staff to work in the front of their stores. And anyone that was a person of color was put in the back to do warehouse work or whatever it might be. And so they were literally hidden and not visible to people coming in. So yeah, it's an interesting one because you might say, well, that's their point of difference, that's their audience, and that's who they're talking to. So naturally, by targeting your audience, you're going to exclude other groups of people. But to me, it comes down to it's about shared interests and shared lifestyles or shared hobbies, and that has nothing to do with identity. As soon as you go into we are only here for white people, well, that's quite ridiculous because one white person to the next white person will be interested in very different things. They'll be living in different places. There'll be different age groups. There'll be different. They'll have different sexual orientation, etc., etc. So it's a really bizarre way to segment your audience in the first place, because those parts of your identity, it's a really strange way to segment your audience, and it's just discriminatory, and it excludes quite deliberately. But it's more about those psychographic traits. If you really love motorbikes or something, and that happens to be your hobby. Well, you could be white, you could be a person of color, you could be gay, you could be old, all of those things. But the thing that glues you together is maybe you all love Harley Davidsons or something. Yeah, to me, it's actually really lazy segmenting when a brand does that. It's really about those psychographic traits that you share as an audience.
Yeah, that supersede the demographics. And what about when you think of a personal brand that are trying to center inclusion? And we know that inclusion is something that we cannot rush. We can't just go like, as you were talking about that ad for Badweiser, they didn't bring people along on the journey. They just kind of sprang it at them. You've got to take people on a journey. And the same is with inclusion. You cannot be exclusive one day and then the next day you're just this inclusive. You have to, even yourself as that personal brand or that organization, you've got to take your people on that journey. You don't one day just change and become something else. What are some of the ways in which personal brands can begin to center inclusion in a way that is not performative? So if somebody came to you and they want to work with you and they're a personal brand, say a coach, and they're like, I just want my brand to feel more inclusive, that I work with people from different backgrounds. It's more about, yes, the psychographics rather than, the demographics, so to speak. What are some of the things they can do so that they are coming from a place of being genuine, knowing that they still have to take that journey of learning what inclusion means and to practice being inclusive? What are some of the things they can do to embrace inclusion in a genuine way and not performative?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I I think transparency. So if they've already got an audience built up and perhaps historically inclusion had never really been a focus, I think transparency is a really key part of bringing your audience along with you on the journey. If you share that you're wanting to go in that direction, but you're still working out how you're going to do it. And you admit that, there's going to be stumbles along the way. I'm not really sure how to do that. I think that humility is really appreciated. We really want to see something real, where we're really sick of seeing slick brand messages that are just a bit too perfect. And if someone comes out with that and there's been no sign of the journey that's been a little bit less graceful because we're humans and we're imperfect, people don't trust it if it's too slick. So we want to see real brands and personal brands. Even more so, it's about the human being. It's your brand is who you are. So absolutely, I would show a little bit more of the vulnerable side, and doesn't mean you've got to share every little detail of your life, but share a little bit about why you want to go on that journey, why it's important, a little bit of your lived experience that adds to that, and I think that really helps. Um, Starting with the individual is quite important as a personal brand. But then I think it's embedding it in your brand itself, and separating that from you as an individual and working out, well, how would you roll that out? How are you going to have more inclusive recruitment practices, for example? Or how will your brand purpose link with your inclusion statement? For, making sure that those things are all connected and they're not separate.
Taking that personal approach and talking about that trust factor. Who knew that sharing your story or your journey from that vulnerable perspective and not slick and polished, as you said, actually does drive that trust? But we live in a society, we are part of structures where perfectionism is glorified, that it needs to be, and we cannot achieve perfection, but there's this thing of it has to be so good, it has to be perfect for it to have deeper reach, for it to really engage people. And what you're saying is that when there isn't any imperfection, it leads to distrust.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been really interesting to see that shift happen. Um, yeah, I think, having a lot of fake fake truth, or TikTok's been a big part of that movement as well. The videos that you see on TikTok are very they're unedited, and there's no filters and all those sorts of things. But it's still a bit of a funny juggle because as a brand, you're still expected to have a certain level of things being very professional and very slick. So it's a tricky balance to know just how vulnerable or how imperfect you can be before someone goes, "Oh, hang on a second, you don't actually have it all together for me to engage with you um, as a a brand." So yeah, it's just getting that balance right, I think.
It sure is a balance because there are those who then go over to the other side and it's so put on, and you're like, whoa, 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 whoa. Slow down. We can see the script even though we can't see the script. Like it's so done, it's so overdone, it's so curated, and it just doesn't seem real anymore. And so it really is a balance. Has the demand for inclusion over the years of running Brandable evolved?
Definitely. So I live in Perth, and I've definitely found that it has changed in the last 3 years. When I started Brandable, there was a real lack of awareness about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and certainly around how do you embed that in your brand work that you do. So I was doing a lot more public speaking, a lot more workshops, and really working on the engagement, on the educational side of Brandable, just making sure that knowledge was being built up. What I've noticed in the last 12 months is that that has changed quite a lot, and the conversations in the marketing space has become a little bit more sophisticated over here than it used to be. Where so WA is quite far behind the East Coast, and certainly we're many, many, many years behind where the UK are and all US as well, although they're very different spaces. Um, but I can see now that there's a desire to do the work, but there's still a lack of understanding of just how deep you need to go to do it well. And maybe that's the case everywhere, I'm not sure, but definitely in WA, the desire's there, the intent is there, but understanding just exactly what that means and how deep you have to go, and that it's a long-term journey. It's one that you never finish. You never reach a finish line, and you can pat yourselves on the back. It's just ongoing. Um, I have a few clients that really understand that. And then I have other clients that are really just starting their journey. So they're really just starting to wrap their heads around what that means. And we're working out, well, how do we take not just the brand and the team, but your audience along that journey with you?
Mm. One of the things I often share with my students and clients around racial inclusion is that in order to be sustainable, a sustainable business that lasts, you know, um, for as long as you would want it to last, something that remains relevant, you cannot bypass diversity, equity, and inclusion in all its forms. You really cannot bypass that. And so, what are the pitfalls for not centering inclusion as a brand?
Well, I think what I like to start with my clients, or if I'm doing a talk, is just start with the facts. So as a nation, Australia is increasingly more and more diverse every year. In WA alone, the migrant population is the largest in the country. It's at 34%, the migrant population. Um, so I start with those stats. You know, one in two, half of us have at least one parent that was born overseas. Um, we speak collectively over 200 languages. One in five of us live with a disability. It's estimated that 11% of the population is part of the LGBTQ plus community, but I would say that number is a lot higher. We're just not asking the right questions, or people aren't feeling safe enough to share those things. So we know that Australia is very diverse. We know that younger generations, Gen Z, Gen Y,
Mm.
are demanding inclusion now. So they want brands that help them to live out their values. And if you can't help them, then they'll go somewhere else. Um, I'm Gen X. My generation was less, we just kind of accepted what we had. But at the same time, I think more like a Gen Z than a Gen X. But things are changing. I think now we're expecting a lot more from brands, and if they say something in a campaign, we're like, well, that's nice, but show us what's going on behind closed doors. So you really want to see the proof. If Nike comes out with a new campaign, you're like, yeah, but what about this? Or what are your ethical practices, or whatever it might be? So we want the proof, and we'll call it out if we don't see it, or if we see the opposite of that. So I usually start with facts, because as a woman of color, and I'm sure Annie, you can relate to this, I find that I've got to be so very careful when I do work in this space that people don't think that I'm just being a little sensitive because I'm a woman of color. And I don't know, I was called some names when I was growing up, and now I've got a bit of a chip on my shoulder. So that's why I do the work. So I try and remove myself a little bit from that. Obviously, my lived experience are very valuable when it comes to talking about women or people of color. Um, but I start with facts. I start with the research, and I go, this isn't about me. This is about your brand and your audience. So if they don't know much about their makeup of their audience, I fall back on the ABS kind of statistics that we can find and say, well, this is the general population. Do you think that's largely reflective of who your audience is? And if yes, then this is who you need to be paying attention to, because those numbers are only going to increase from what we can tell. So unless brands want to lose their relevance and become like increasingly more disconnected with audiences, they really should be thinking about inclusion now. At some point, I think all brands will have to do it, but the brands that have done the work and have genuinely built inclusive brands from the inside out will be in a much better place to say, yes, we're already doing it. And then they can put out a campaign that is very inclusive and celebrates diversity, and people will believe it because they've seen it for years. But the brands that suddenly come out and say, "Oh yeah, me too," that's not going to fly. So they will be many, many years behind. And as we both know, there's a lot of work that goes into changing a team's culture, let alone brand purpose and all of those big things. So yeah, the time is really now to be centering inclusion in your brand work.
Yes, actually, the time is yesterday, Tess.
Yeah.
It needs to be something that you're absolutely thinking about, and you're taking some form of action to address that. And I love how you brought up the different generations, and as we move forward from a sustainability perspective, what Gen Z is asking for, what Gen Ys are asking for, they want to see that form of inclusion, and if it's not there, they're simply not going to engage. And so, yes, back to relevance and back to this being an absolute necessity for survival in the market. Inclusion is just part and parcel of how we do life and business, which is something that I say very, very often in my work. And so as we wind up, Tess, what is your dream for Brandable?
I would love for every marketing consultancy or brand agency out there to just naturally be embedding inclusion in how they do their work. So I would love Brandable to be part of a collective rather than just a one-off agency that does this work. I would love to have many agencies and teams that that have the same philosophy and the same way of working so that we can create better work together. I think there's only so much change that one team or one person can make, but the more that we influence other people and collaborate with others, collectively, it's a ripple effect, and we'll create more and more change that way. And the older that I get, the more impatient I get about seeing that change. And I want to see it for my kids. I don't want them to grow up in the same world that I did. I want them to be able to see an ad or read a book, or buy clothes and see themselves celebrated in those products and those and the content and the entertainment that they see around them. I want them to be able to choose a foundation that's made for them. That's just there in Woolies and Coles, which still doesn't happen to this day. So those changes are going to take a lot of people, and Brandable alone's not going to do it. But the philosophy behind Brandable is what I'm hoping will spread, and people will start changing how they do brand strategy and actually put inclusion at the center.
I love that dream for you. And I really, really do believe that if we can embrace that it would truly make a difference in how we show up, how we do life, how we interact with one another. And I love what you mentioned there about being a mother. You're a mother to two little girls, a foster mom, and they're two young Noongar girls. Could you tell us a little bit about your journey of becoming a foster mom, and perhaps how this work that you're now doing of diversity, equity, and inclusion, Brandable, has been further cemented, and there's a deeper why to what you do, I believe.
Yeah, I think, so my husband and I, we became foster parents about 4 years ago, and we haven't had children of our own, so we really felt that we wanted to do something. We had a lot of love to give, and we wanted children in our lives, and we landed on fostering. It's been an eye-opening journey. It's not an easy one. It's quite unsettling because you never know whether children that are living with you are going to be reunified. We are in a position, our situation now, without going into too much detail, is more stable, which is lovely for everyone. But I guess the way it links to Brandable is I realized that just our lives alone had so many little unique elements to it. I'm a person of color. I was born in Seychelles. I use the term woman of color all the time because to me it's a term of solidarity, and I love it because it feels bigger than just trying to find other women who were born in Seychelles, which is a very small group, by the way, in Australia, especially in WA. Mostly they're my cousins. But I realized that my experience was quite unique. I was born in Seychelles. I came here as a 9-year-old. I've lived in a country town. I've married a white man whose dad is from England. All these little bits and pieces come together, and we have quite a very different life from the next person. But doesn't mean we're special. It just means that's just how human beings are. So you look at the next person and they've got their own amazing, unique lived experiences and identities that kind of come together and form this mishmash of very unique experiences. And being foster parents on top of that added this other layer where people, I've realized, have very little understanding of what fostering is. And a lot of people think it's adoption, which is completely different. And there's some permanency and predictability in adoption, that you just don't have in fostering. So even that element of making sure that people are aware that lives are really different. You know, a foster family is just another type of family. It's our normal, but to someone else, they might look in on our lives and go, "Wow, that's so different. I don't know how you do that." But for us, it's like this is our normal, and this is our family. And I guess with Brandable, I was really driven to make sure that people realize that there is no normal, and we all have our own lives, and they're all really different, and they're all really human, and trying not to center, um, historically centered groups all the time, and making sure that we're seeing that there are these different groups of people out there that live very differently. And in fact, that's most of us. We just try to fit these boxes that are like normative boxes that we're supposed to fit in. And I'm so keen to just blow up those boxes and just say, well, there's just no boxes. Like, can we just be human beings and celebrate that? Because that's pretty amazing, pretty special.
You know, what I think is amazing is the kind of human beings who take on that journey of fostering. I think it is a really, really special, unique human, your husband included, to go through that journey. And so, wow, what a story. Thank you so much for sharing that bit with us. As a final question, Tess, if fear was not a factor, how would you show up in your work?
I would be less diplomatic, I think. I have learned to be very diplomatic in my life. I'm an expert code switcher. Um, I know how to move in and out of white spaces or spaces not built for me. And if fear was not a factor, I would just not care about those things, and I would just show up. But of course, we've got to navigate these things and work out, well, is that person ready for me to show all of myself today? Or are we still a few months away from one mask being peeled off? So yeah, fear wasn't it's not even fear. I guess it's if we didn't have to worry about repercussions or worry about the consequences, um, I would just show up as myself, and I wouldn't be so diplomatic. I'd just be really honest, which is actually kind of like my natural way of being, certainly with my family. But when I'm outside of home, I'm very diplomatic,
Mm.
and I'm very good at code switching. I'm just more aware I'm doing it now.
And I think a lot of women of color would relate to the switching, because as soon as you said it, I was just nodding, like, yep, you just know the spaces you step into, the costume, so to speak, that you need to put on. And when you get out of there, when you're with your family, you're just different. There's so much code switching that happens. And it's all from a place of safety. It's all from a place of protecting yourself and being in spaces where you feel you will not be harmed.
Absolutely.
Where can people find you and connect with you? Because the work that you're doing is, and I do not say this lightly at all, is so needed, is so brilliant. Why aren't we hearing more about other brandables out there? How can people connect with you?
My website is brandable.inc, INK. So there's a contact form there. You can fill it out and it comes straight to my inbox. I pretty much live on LinkedIn, so I've been known to develop really great relationships with people before I've even met them, and it's not uncommon to meet someone after 2 years of chatting on LinkedIn, and then randomly at a networking event we'll see each other across the room, and that'll be the first time we actually meet face to face. But
Mm.
LinkedIn is my happy place. It's where I join a lot of great conversations. When I have time, I'm posting a lot because there's a lot of thoughts that I'm sharing around the way that I do the work through Brandable. If I'm not posting, that means I'm really busy on client work.
Mm.
But I'm still there. I'm always on LinkedIn, just about every day. So please look me up. The Brandable company page is on there. Please follow us because we'll always share some really helpful tips on there from time to time. And Instagram as well, Brandable_agency. Please follow us there, and we share the same style content there as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. All those links will be in the show notes, so be sure to check them out there. Tess, thank you so much for being here. I have loved this conversation.
My pleasure, Annie. It's been wonderful.
We are represented. We are represented. We are represented.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Why don't you go ahead and hit that subscribe button and leave a review so this podcast can reach more online business owners, and together we can begin to normalize racial inclusion in the online coaching space. I'd love to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where this podcast episode was recorded, the Wiradjuri people in central New South Wales, Australia. Music produced in Nairobi, Kenya by Patrick St. Mbaru and Kambua Mathu. Vocals by Joanne Matata.
Represented.